Is this your choice or theirs?
I choose stability.
The $900 million ticket is unclaimed.
No, no way. 900 million?
And Daniel Mercer signed the separation papers at 8:47 on a Tuesday night in his in-law's living room with his overnight bag already packed by someone else and sitting by the door. And his wife sat across from him, her hands folded, her father standing to her left, like a man who had already decided the outcome before the room was arranged. Nobody looked at the television running in the background. Nobody noticed the lottery broadcast. And nobody knew that the inside breast pocket of the field jacket Daniel wore had been carrying $900 million since that afternoon, a lottery ticket he had already forgotten he was holding. Welcome to today's story. And if you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And 6 hours earlier, Daniel had been 140 miles away, doing what he always did, working. The work was not glamorous. It never had been. Mercer Environmental Solutions operated out of a converted warehouse on Kinston Avenue on the south side of Raleigh, and a two-room office with a separate bay for equipment storage, good ventilation because of the chemicals they stored, and a coffee maker that had been with the company longer than most of the staff. And Daniel had founded the company 11 years ago with a used soil sampler, a second-hand air monitoring kit, and a conviction he hadn't been entirely able to explain to people at the time. And his father, Calvin, had worked industrial maintenance for 22 years, the kind of work that keeps plants running and rarely appears in any record that matters. He died of chronic respiratory disease at 64, and the physicians cited prolonged occupational exposure to byproduct particulates that had never been formally monitored at the facility where he spent most of his career. Nobody had tested the air. Nobody had told the workers what they were breathing. And nobody had told the neighborhood that surrounded the plant either. Daniel had been 30 when Calvin died. He spent the next 3 years learning everything he could about environmental testing methodology, regulatory compliance, and the specific gap between what industrial operations were legally required to monitor and what they actually monitored in practice. Mercer Environmental was the answer he arrived at, a small firm capable of going into the places that large consulting outfits bypassed, and because the contract values were too modest, and doing the work that needed doing there. It was not a glamorous business model, but it was his. He had married Lydia Caldwell 6 years into the company's life, and he had believed at the time that she understood what the work was and why it mattered. In the early years, she had brought him lunch at the warehouse when he was running late on a testing schedule, and she had sat across from him at the kitchen table while he reviewed sample reports and asked questions that showed she was actually reading the documents. She said once that she loved that he knew what he was fighting for, and he had believed her because everything she did in those years confirmed it. The Caldwell family had a different relationship with the concept of conviction. Warren Caldwell had made his money as a corporate attorney and converted it into commercial property development upon retirement, and he lived in Westover Hills, hosted charity events twice a year, and measured other men by the visible ease of their financial position, not by how it had been earned or what it had cost. And he had been cordial to Daniel in the early years of the marriage, in the way a man is cordial to a vendor he's not yet decided whether to renew. As Mercer Environmental moved through a difficult stretch, and a major state environmental contract frozen mid-execution due to a federal investigation entirely unrelated to Daniel's work, Warren's cordiality cooled to something quieter. Renata, Lydia's mother, found subtler methods, mentioning friends whose husbands had recently acquired vacation properties, and noting that another couple had taken 3 weeks abroad. She never needed to say anything directly. The implication accumulated. Lydia's brother Keaton was less careful. He had borrowed money from Daniel twice, once to cover a lease shortfall, and once to keep a failed business venture from triggering a default. Both times he'd thanked Daniel warmly in the short term and treated him with quiet contempt in the long term. Daniel had never called in either debt. He hadn't thought he needed to. And the only person in the Caldwell family who did not participate in the slow diminishment was Fiona, Lydia's cousin, 35, who worked as an archivist at the university and attended family gatherings with the watchful stillness of someone cataloging everything she observed. And she never joined when the conversation turned sideways toward Daniel's professional struggles, though she rarely intervened directly either. He had thought of her, for years, as neutral, not for him, not against him, simply present. He would not think that for much longer, and the state contract that had anchored Mercer Environmental's projections for 18 months had been frozen 5 months ago when a procurement official at the administering agency was placed under federal investigation for kickbacks from a competing contractor. And Daniel's work had gone through a separate division, a separate review process, evaluated on technical merit by a separate team. He was clean. The investigation had nothing to do with him. None of that had mattered to the freeze. And his largest revenue source disappeared overnight. He sold a core piece of field equipment, deferred his own salary, took a bridge loan at terms he would not have accepted in any other circumstance. He kept the firm's payroll intact. He kept the lights on. And he had not touched a single dollar of the household savings. He had never mixed the two. Lydia had moved the household savings to a personal account 3 months ago, citing concern that a business collapse might sweep everything. And she had said it matter-of-factly, as if she had already thought it through. He had explained that the accounts had always been separate. She had listened and said she felt better with the money somewhere she controlled. And that was the first time he understood she had already started making different plans. The drive back toward Raleigh that Tuesday afternoon, with the testing equipment secured in the truck bed and the day's documentation on the seat beside him, was quiet. And his phone sat in the cup holder. He had not looked at it in 2 hours. Somewhere in the inside breast pocket of his field jacket, the worn olive green one he'd had for 4 years, the one that smelled faintly of calibration fluid. And red clay was a small piece of paper he had already forgotten entirely. Lydia's name appeared on his phone screen at 6:12 p.m. He answered on the second ring. "Family dinner tonight," she said. "Everyone's here. And we need to talk about us." He recognized the phrasing, careful, prepared, the kind of language that had been thought through before it was spoken. He told himself it might still be a conversation. And he told himself he had been in difficult rooms before, had stayed calm through them, had found a way through. He drove toward Westover Hills into the early dark, past neighborhoods he had tested and properties he had cleared, and carrying something in his jacket pocket that would have changed every assumption in that house if anyone had known to look. The morning had started before the sun. Daniel left Raleigh at 5:15, before the city's commuter rhythm had fully arranged itself, and with a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and the day's documentation binder in the passenger seat. The remote site was a 40-acre parcel off NC 64 near the Harnett County line, and formerly adjacent to a light industrial corridor that had operated through the 1980s and 90s before a series of closures left the land dormant and the soil chemistry largely undocumented. A community advocacy group had hired Mercer Environmental to produce an independent assessment, and before they brought in a third-party remediation firm, the kind of contract that didn't pay much but mattered to the people who lived nearby. He drove out with the windows cracked despite the October chill, and the way he had always preferred for early morning field work. Enough air circulation to stay sharp, enough cold to keep the thinking clear. The road between Raleigh and the site passed through country he had driven many times, stretches of pine, and occasional cleared lots with new construction footings poured, small towns arranged around a single main road intersection. He had tested sites in most of these counties. He knew the landscape by soil type and drainage pattern before he knew it by landmark. And the parcel was everything the documentation suggested: moderately contaminated in the eastern quadrant nearest the former industrial boundary, better than expected in the western third. He spent 5 hours pulling samples, running preliminary air quality readings with the portable monitor, and documenting conditions in the field log he kept in a waterproof sleeve on his vest. A contractor from another firm had installed a series of groundwater monitoring wells 3 years earlier, and 2 of them had either been improperly sealed or had shifted with the soil. He noted the discrepancies, flagged them for the client's remediation firm, and photographed the installations from multiple angles. This was what the work looked like in practice. And not a boardroom, not a contract announcement. A man in worn field clothes, in cold October mud, doing the methodical work that determined whether a neighborhood was safe to build on or not. And he finished by 2 in the afternoon and began the drive back. On NC-64, 40 minutes out from Crosswinds, his phone buzzed with a message from Tom Alvarez. Tom had been with Mercer Environmental since the 2nd year, when the firm had consisted of Daniel and a borrowed truck and a single commercial testing contract. He was the kind of technician who thought of a site the way a good mechanic thought of an engine, not as a system to be processed, but as something with its own logic that you had to learn before you could fix it. His text read, "Attorney from state agency called," said the audit concluded. "Said they want to talk." And number attached. Daniel read the message twice, pulled the number into a note he'd return to once he was back on a stronger signal. The possibility that the contract might be reinstated had existed since the audit began, but he had trained himself not to build on it until it was confirmed in writing. He had learned the hard way what it cost to plan around revenue that hadn't arrived yet. He tucked the phone back into the cup holder and kept driving. And Crosswinds Country Mart appeared on his right about 20 minutes later, a low building with 2 gas pump islands, a hand-painted sign faded from sun and weather, and a small neon open indicator in the window. And he had stopped there twice before, on other trips out to the eastern county sites. The coffee was adequate. The gas was cheaper than the stations on the interstate. He pulled in, topped off the tank, and went inside for coffee and a bottle of water. And the man behind the register was in his late 60s, name tag reading Grady, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the way of a person who puts them there and forgets they're there. And the receipt printer was producing a continuous slow grinding noise that suggested a near-empty roll. Daniel set the coffee and water on the counter. Grady rang them up. Then he opened the register, looked at the coin tray, and made a small apologetic sound. And running short on quarters, he said, "Forgot to get change from the office this morning. All I've got is dimes." He looked up over the glasses he wasn't wearing, "Unless you want a lottery ticket." And the change on this is $173, and I've got a $5 scratch ticket right here. State owes me money anyway. He was already holding it out, one of the scratch tickets from the display rack beside the register, a green and gold design with the NC Lottery logo across the top. Daniel almost waved it off. He nearly said, "Don't worry about it." He was already thinking about Tom's message and the drive back and what the attorney from the agency's call might mean. But Grady was holding it patiently, not pushing, just waiting with the particular ease of an older man who had decided life was too short to make anything into a larger transaction than it needed to be. It seemed rude to decline. "Sure," Daniel said, "thanks." He took the ticket, folded it once without looking at it, and tucked it into the inside breast pocket of his field jacket, the same pocket where he kept his waterproof notepad and the charging cable he never remembered to leave in the truck. By the time he had recapped the coffee thermos and pushed out through the glass door back into the October afternoon, the ticket had already ceased to exist in his thinking. He merged back onto NC-64, heading northwest toward Raleigh. The pines along the road threw long shadows in the late afternoon angle of the light. He thought about Tom's message, and he thought about the bridge loan balance and what a contract reinstatement would mean for the timeline on paying it down. He thought, briefly, about Lydia and the conversation they had not been having for the past several weeks, and the space that had opened in the house that neither of them was filling. His phone rang at 6:12. Lydia. Her voice had a quality he recognized, the careful, prepared sound of language that had been thought through before it was delivered. And she said there was a family dinner at the Caldwell house that evening. Everyone was there. They needed to talk about us. He told himself the dinner might still be a conversation. And that sitting down together with her family present might be the reset he had been hoping for. A chance to lay out the actual facts of Mercer Environmental's position, the state contract situation, the audit that had apparently just concluded in his favor. And he had been in difficult rooms before. He had stayed calm through them. He told himself the suitcase was probably not already packed. He drove toward Westover Hills. The ticket was in his jacket pocket. And the winning numbers had been drawn at 7:45 the previous evening, and the results had been running on the state lottery's website for 19 hours. The jackpot had reached $900 million after 19 consecutive weeks without a winner. And nobody at Crosswinds Country Mart knew what was in the scratch ticket Grady had handed across the counter. Nobody in Raleigh knew. Nobody at the Caldwell house, where the lights were already on in every room, knew. Daniel did not know. And he would know something, though, before this night was over, something that had nothing to do with the ticket. He would know the exact second when a person decides to look towards someone else before they speak, and what that second reveals about where their loyalty actually lives. That was the knowledge he was driving toward. The other knowledge, the kind printed on a piece of paper folded twice in his breast pocket, could wait. And for now, it was still just a ticket he'd accepted because the register was short on quarters. The Caldwell house in Westover Hills had its lights on in every room when Daniel pulled onto the block. And Warren's car was in the driveway, and so were Renata's and Keaton's. A fourth vehicle he didn't immediately place was parked along the curb. All of it arranged on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, and with no explanation beyond Lydia's 6 words over the phone. He sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine. The street was quiet, the neighborhood the specific kind of quiet that comes with money. And no ambient noise from open windows, no competing sounds from adjacent lots, just the low hum of a suburb that had decided long ago it had achieved the right distance from everything unpleasant. He went up the front walk, and the door opened before he reached the step. Lydia stood in the doorway. She was dressed as though she had thought carefully about it, not formal but composed. She stepped back to let him in without reaching for him, and the foyer arranged itself in front of him before his eyes had fully adjusted from the dark outside. Warren stood near the far wall, arms at his sides, in the posture of a man who has positioned himself to be seen as calm, and Renatus sat on the low bench near the staircase. Keaton was to the left, near the entrance to the living room, leaning slightly against the wall frame. Fiona sat in the armchair near the window, apart from the others, her hands in her lap, watching, and on the floor beside the door, Daniel's overnight bag, the blue field duffel he used for multi-day site work, his initials on the handle tag. It had been in the closet of the bedroom 2 days ago, and he had not asked for it, had not packed it, had not known it would be here. Someone had packed it without telling him it would be needed. Warren spoke first, and he laid out his position the way a man delivers a prepared statement, measured, unhurried, looking at Daniel with the composure of someone who has decided that composure is itself a form of authority. And he said that Daniel had failed to provide financial stability in a reasonable time frame, that Lydia had exercised patience well beyond what anyone could fairly ask, that the right thing at this point was to acknowledge what the past months had made clear and move forward accordingly. Renata added that Lydia had supported Daniel through considerable difficulty, and that support was not unlimited. She said it with the careful evenness of someone who has rehearsed it enough times that it no longer feels unkind. And Keaton said from his position near the wall that Mercer Environmental had always been more ambition than business. He said it in the tone of someone who has been waiting a long time to say it openly. And then he reached into his jacket and raised his phone slightly, angling it toward Daniel with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. Daniel noticed. He said nothing. What he also noticed in the same moment was Fiona, and she had been still, almost absorbed into the background of the room. When Keaton raised his phone, something shifted in her expression, a tightening at the corners of her eyes, a decision being made, and her right hand moved to her phone in her lap. She opened the camera app without looking at it, without announcing it, without anything in her posture indicating what she was doing. And she simply held the phone with the screen facing forward and let it run. Daniel looked back at Keaton. He reminded him, without heat, without anything but the deliberate flatness of a fact being returned to its rightful place in a conversation, and that Mercer Environmental's revenue had covered Keaton's lease shortfall when he couldn't make rent for 4 months in 2020, and that it had covered the collapse of his consulting business in 2022, which had not been a small shortfall. And he said it as a correction, not an accusation, just a thing that deserved to be in the room if the room was going to discuss what Daniel had or hadn't contributed. Keaton's phone stayed up. He didn't respond to the correction directly, and he waited. Lydia set a folder on the coffee table. Daniel recognized it before she said anything. The shape of it, the weight of a folder with documents inside, and the particular kind of folder that comes from an attorney's office rather than a home printer. She slid it toward him. "I spoke with an attorney," she said. "The papers are ready. I just need your signature to make it official." And he picked up the folder and read through it. He read everything. The separation agreement was thorough, professionally drafted, specific about asset division and mutual release of claims. This had not been put together in the last week, and it had been in preparation for some time, long enough to be revised, reviewed, and signed by Lydia, whose signature appeared on the last page in blue ink. He understood then that the conversation he had imagined on the drive over, the one, and where they found a way through together, where the temperature came down and something was salvaged, had never been the plan. This room, this folder, this arrangement of people who had arrived before him and packed his bag for him was the plan, and had been the plan for longer than tonight. He set the folder down on the coffee table. He asked one question. "Is this your decision, Lydia, or is it theirs?" She looked at him for a moment, and then her eyes moved, just briefly, involuntarily, a half-second turn of her head toward her father. Warren stood at his position near the wall. The movement was small, and a single glance that lasted less than a second before she looked back at Daniel. She said, "I'm choosing stability." He understood that this was the honest answer. He picked up the pen she had placed beside the folder and signed his name on the line. And where his signature was required, Warren moved to the side table and held out his hand. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket for his house key. He found the key. He also felt beneath his fingers, and the folded edge of a piece of paper he had forgotten was there. He withdrew only the key and set it on the table. Warren walked to the front door and opened it. The blue duffel was nudged incrementally toward the threshold, and Daniel picked it up. Keaton lowered his phone. Fiona had not moved. Daniel stepped out into the October night. The air had dropped since he'd arrived, somewhere in the low 50s now, the smell of wet leaves and pavement, and the door closed behind him. He heard the deadbolt turn. He walked down the front path to the driveway. The night was still. He reached the end of the walk and stopped. He was standing there, duffel in hand, when he remembered. And there was something he hadn't thought about when he'd handed over the key. Something that wasn't in the duffel, and wasn't replaceable, and had nothing to do with any of this. Not the money, not the company, and not the separation agreement with his signature drying on it. His father had kept a field journal during his years in industrial maintenance. A worn leather notebook, Calvin's handwriting on every page, conditions he had observed, equipment decisions made under pressure, and the particular details of a working life that had never made it into any official document. Daniel had been given it by Calvin's foreman after the funeral. He had kept it on the bedroom shelf for 8 years, and he had looked at it in ways that had nothing to do with the information it contained. It was still on the shelf. He had not seen it in the duffel. That was not an accident. And he stood at the end of the Caldwell driveway in the October cold and understood that Lydia had known exactly what that notebook meant to him. She had not put it in the bag, she had not forgotten it, and she had simply not put it there, in a room full of people who had decided his exit, and that was its own form of communication. He could go back, ring the doorbell, say it was in the bedroom, and he needed it. And it had nothing to do with money or the company or anything that had been decided tonight. He thought about Keaton's phone. He thought about the sound of the deadbolt. He picked up the duffel and kept walking. And in the breast pocket of his field jacket, folded once, was a piece of paper he had accepted at a gas station register because the cashier was short on quarters and it seemed impolite to refuse. He did not think about it. And he was not thinking about anything except the weight of the duffel, the distance to his truck, and specific flatness that comes when you finally understand something has been over much longer than you knew. And he drove west on I-40, no destination he was willing to name yet. The truck's heater was on, but it took time, older vehicle, slower to warm. And for the first several miles, the cab stayed cold enough that his breath was faintly visible. He drove through the city's overnight lighting, past the stretches of commercial corridor that never fully went dark, and eventually pulled into a rest stop on the far side of Cary where a few other vehicles sat in corners of the lot with their lights off. He turned off the engine and sat. The duffel was in the cab behind his seat, and he hadn't opened it. He had no reason to know what was inside, and several reasons not to look yet. He pulled his jacket tighter and thought about nothing in particular, which is to say, he thought about everything in the way you do when you have just experienced the particular collapse of a belief you had been carrying longer than you knew. The belief that the difficulty was temporary, and that being in a hard season together was still being in it together. He had walked into that house believing they were in a crisis. She had walked in knowing they were already on the other side of it, and the frost started forming on the inside of the windshield sometime after midnight. He didn't bother running the engine for heat. He pulled his jacket around him and let the cold settle in the same way the silence had settled, and something to simply be inside of until morning arrived and required something more. He kept returning to the same moment, the question he had asked, the half-second before she answered, the involuntary turn of her eyes toward her father, and a movement small enough that she might not have known she did it, before she looked back at Daniel and said what she had decided to say. He had asked whose decision this was, and she had answered by looking first at the person who had decided for her. That was not cruelty, exactly. It was something worse. It was the specific truth of a person who has spent so long allowing someone else to make the difficult decisions that they have forgotten how to make them alone. By 5 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and drove the remaining distance to the Verser Environmental Office on Kinston Avenue. And the building was dark when he arrived, the neighboring businesses still closed. He unlocked the back door, went to the break room, and made coffee with the machine that had been there since before Tom. He sat at his desk in the empty office and went through the numbers he already knew by memory. Outstanding payroll balance, bridge loan balance, equipment lease, monthly overhead, projected cash flow if the state contract remained frozen. The arithmetic had not changed. It was still the same wall, and he had just spent the night in a parking lot rather than a house when he arrived at it. When the team arrived at 7:30, he asked them to gather before they started work, and he stood in the center of the office and told them the truth. His marriage had ended the previous night. He no longer had a place to live. The company's financial position remained serious, and he did not know how many weeks of normal operations were left. He told them he would not be using any wages due to them to stabilize his personal situation. Every dollar that came in would go to payroll first, and he told them that if any of them needed to find more stable work immediately, he would write references that accurately reflected what they had contributed here. He said it because they deserved honesty more than they deserved a performance of confidence he didn't feel. And no one left. A few people looked at their shoes. One of the younger technicians, a woman named Priya who had joined 3 months ago, looked like she wanted to say something and settled on a single careful nod instead. And Tom Alvarez waited until the others had gone back to their stations. He came over to where Daniel was standing and held out two things: a key on a plain ring and his phone showing a voicemail transcript. And the key was for the basement apartment at Tom's house on Barwell Road. Finished space, private entrance, its own heat. Tom had used it during a stretch when his father was ill and he needed to be close without the full commute. And he wasn't using it now. Daniel could stay as long as he needed. No timeline on it. The voicemail was from the attorney at the State Environmental Agency. The audit had concluded. And the investigation had found no connection between the compromised procurement official and Mercer Environmental's contract, which had been through a separate division and a separate review process from the beginning. The contract was cleared for reinstatement, pending standard administrative paperwork, and she would send the formal documentation that afternoon. Daniel looked at both of them for a moment. Then he set the key in his jacket pocket on the same side as the scratch ticket he had already forgotten, and told Tom he'd be at the storage unit retrieving a piece of equipment. He drove west on New Bern Avenue. The radio was on at low volume, a local station that ran news in the morning, and then local features through the midday hours, then traffic and weather. He wasn't fully listening. He was going through the reinstatement math in his head. What the contract revenue meant for the bridge loan timeline, what it meant for the equipment account, and what it meant for the payroll guarantee he had just made. The radio anchor's voice cut into the music. She said the NC Lottery was asking for help identifying the winner of the previous evening's $900 million jackpot. And the winning ticket had been sold at a convenience store in Harnett County, Crosswinds Country Mart on NC 64. The winner had not yet come forward. Daniel looked at the radio. Then he looked at the road. And then he reached into the breast pocket of his field jacket without fully deciding to, and pulled out the folded piece of paper that had been there since the afternoon before. He pulled over into the parking lot of a discount hardware store and cut the engine, unfolded the ticket. He took out his phone and looked up the NC Lottery results for the previous evening. The winning numbers from the Tuesday night draw. He looked at the ticket, then at his phone. The first number matched, and he looked at the second. It matched. He went through all 6 numbers. Then he put the phone down and picked it up again and used a second site to confirm the winning numbers, telling himself that sites sometimes had errors and that he was reading the wrong draw, that there were obvious explanations for all 6 of these numbers appearing to correspond. He checked a third time using the NC Lottery's official website directly. Every single number was correct. All 6, and in sequence. He sat there for a long time, with the heater running and the radio still going softly in the background, and the parking lot of a hardware store arranged around him in the ordinary way of a Wednesday morning. And he sat with $900 million in his hands, printed on a piece of paper, the size of a bookmark, that he had accepted as change because the man at the register was short on quarters and it seemed impolite to refuse. And what he felt was not what he had expected to feel if he had ever imagined this moment, which he had not. It was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was something closer to vertigo. And the specific dizziness of discovering that reality has been different from your understanding of it for the past 18 hours, and you are only now catching up. He thought about the house key he had left on Warren Caldwell's side table, and he thought about his father's journal, still off in a bedroom he couldn't get back into. He thought about Tom handing him a key without being asked, the same way Tom had shown up for 18 months of deferred raises, and a 6-week lapse in health insurance, and never once suggested he was owed more than he was given. The money was real, but he had learned enough hard lessons in the past several months to know that the moment immediately and after something enormous changes is the worst possible moment to make decisions. He put the ticket carefully in the zipped inner pocket of the duffel, somewhere with less exposure than a breast pocket that had been gathering field jacket residue since spring, and picked up his phone again. He scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in a year. Dana Hartley, attorney. He had worked with her twice in the early years of Mercer Environmental on business structure and a contract dispute. And methodical, unfazed, the kind of person who treated information like a resource to be organized before it could be used. He pressed call. She answered on the third ring. He told her he had something important and needed to see her today. And he didn't tell her what it was. She cleared her afternoon and told him to come to her office at noon. He put the truck back in gear and sat for one more moment in the hardware store parking lot, looking at nothing in particular, and understanding that the world had just changed in a way he had no framework for yet, and that, somewhere in Westover Hills, in a house where all the lights had been on last night, nobody had any idea. And Dana Hartley's office was on the third floor of a building on Fayetteville Street, a space that managed to be both efficient and comfortable, not the performance of expensive law, but the function of it, and framed diplomas in a single column rather than spread across the wall, 2 chairs across from the desk, both the same height, a window behind her that let in afternoon light without creating the kind of glare that makes a meeting feel like an interrogation. And she was at the desk when Daniel arrived, already reviewing something, and she did not make a performance of setting it aside. She looked at him the way she always did, direct, professionally calibrated, ready to receive information rather than impressions. And he sat down across from her. He took the folded ticket from the zipped inner pocket of the duffel he had set on the floor beside the chair and placed it on the desk between them. She looked at it without picking it up, and then she looked at him. "Tell me where it came from," she said. He told her. "The site visit, NC 64, Crosswinds Country Mart, the register short on quarters, Grady with the reading glasses, and the ticket taken out of courtesy and tucked away and forgotten entirely." He described the sequence the way he described a site finding, chronologically, without editorializing. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she made a note on the legal pad she kept at her right hand. Then she asked, "What's the status of your marriage?" He told her. The call from Lydia at 6:12 the previous evening, the drive to Westover Hills, and the Caldwell house arranged and waiting, his duffel packed before he arrived, the separation agreement on the coffee table, drafted and reviewed and signed by Lydia, his signature on the final page. She typed something on her laptop. Then she looked up, and "I need to check the filing date of the separation," she said. "Do you know when Lydia's attorney filed the initial papers?" He didn't know the exact date. He said it had clearly been in preparation for some time. The document was professional, thorough, and the kind that takes more than a few days to draft and review. She pulled up a legal records search through her case management system. The separation proceeding had been filed and recorded 3 days ago, before Daniel's trip to the remote site, and she looked at the date on her laptop. Then she looked at the lottery ticket. Then she looked at Daniel. "The ticket was purchased yesterday afternoon," she said, "after the separation was legally underway." "Yes. And in North Carolina, assets acquired after the date of separation are separate property." She said it the way she said everything, clearly, without drama, as a professional reporting on a finding. "This ticket and whatever it's worth is yours alone. And your wife has no legal claim on it. Nothing about what happened last night changes that." Daniel sat with that for a moment. It was the confirmation he had suspected, but hearing it stated plainly by someone and whose job was to be precise made it something different, a fact rather than a calculation. Dana picked up the ticket, examined both sides, set it down. She walked him through the recommended process. Keep the ticket in secure storage, and until they could arrange proper handling, file nothing and announce nothing for at least 2 weeks. Take no major financial decisions in the short term. She would begin working on a trust structure immediately, and the same general approach she had helped him set up for Mercer Environmental's assets, but more comprehensive. She also told him something else. She said it without drama, as a professional observation rather than a warning, and the way someone shares relevant information before it has become a problem. "Once this becomes public, people from your recent past will come back," she said. "That's not speculation. It happens with a degree of predictability that we can both plan around. And The people who remove themselves will return. Your only job at that point will be learning to distinguish genuine regret from regret about a missed opportunity. The two can look very similar from the outside. He said he understood. And she looked at him for a moment, the kind of look that assesses whether someone means what they say. Is there anything that could complicate this? She asked. Anything they might try to use against you? He thought for a moment. And then he told her about the journal. Calvin's field notebook, worn leather cover, his father's handwriting on every page, 8 years on a bedroom shelf. He described it without elaboration. What it was, what it meant, where it currently was. And Dana made a note, said she'd look into what options existed for retrieval. He drove from her office to Tom's house on Barwell Road. The apartment entrance was on the side of the house, and a wooden door with a single pane of glass, a small landing, and steps down to a finished space with a low ceiling and a window at ground level that faced the backyard. And it smelled of old wood and faintly of motor oil from the garage above, and it was entirely warm. He set the duffel on the floor in the center of the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and a twin with a wool blanket folded at the foot. He sat there in the late afternoon and did not turn on the light. He thought about his father, Calvin Mercer, 40 years in Raleigh, and worker in industries that rarely saw their working conditions examined the way the products they produced were examined. He had died knowing some things about his body's failure and not knowing others, and because the monitoring that would have answered the others hadn't been done. The companies he had worked for were not unusual in this. They were simply typical, and typical is its own kind of negligence when the stakes are health. And Mercer Environmental had been built on the belief that knowing the actual conditions of a place was a form of protection. That data existed to protect people, and that the people least able to commission the data were often the most at risk of being harmed by its absence. And Daniel sat in the basement apartment with more money than he had ever imagined having. And he thought about what it was for. Not in the abstract, he knew the abstract version. And he thought about what it was specifically for, given who he was and what he had built and why he had built it. The Caldwells believed right now that he was sitting somewhere with nowhere to go and a company that had barely survived. And they believed that the situation had concluded in the way they had arranged it. He did not feel compelled to correct that impression yet. Not out of strategy, he simply had nothing to say to any of them that he hadn't already said. And he pulled out his phone and read Tom's message about the reinstatement one more time. He wrote back, "Thanks for handling the call. I'll reach out to them first thing tomorrow. Let's plan for a full team meeting on Friday." And then he set the phone down and sat in the dark basement for a little longer, understanding something that Dana had said and not fully said, that the people who come back and after something like this are not necessarily the same people who left. They are the same people, but they now know something they didn't know before. The question, the only question, was whether what they knew was you, or whether what they knew was what you had. He didn't have an answer yet. He suspected he would, before long. He lay back on the narrow bed with his jacket still on, because the room was warm enough, but not enough to fully release the residual cold of the night before, and he let himself sleep for the first time in nearly 20 hours. Outside, on a Wednesday afternoon, Raleigh continued in its ordinary motions, traffic on Barwell Road, and a dog somewhere in the neighboring yard whined through the backyard oaks that still carried most of their October leaves. He slept until the light changed. He worked through the recovery, the same way he had always worked through problems at Mercer Environmental, and one item at a time, in order of actual priority, without the kind of announcement that turns the solving of problems into a performance. The bridge loan came first. He arranged payment in full through the trust structure Dana had built in the 48 hours following their meeting, and, careful, deliberately understated, moved through legal entities that would hold up to scrutiny without triggering attention before he was ready for it. The loan balance cleared on a Thursday. The creditor's confirmation email arrived at 7 in the morning, and he read it at his desk, and before anyone else arrived, and felt something he had no precise name for. Not relief, exactly, more like the particular sensation of setting down a weight you had been carrying long enough that you had forgotten you were holding it. And he paid the outstanding payroll next. Every deferred dollar, his own included, though that was the last to be addressed, was made whole. He sent the payroll confirmation to Tom and asked him to tell the team. And he did not make a speech about it. The equipment account came after that. He bought back the piece he had sold during the worst stretch of the freeze, a portable XRF analyzer, 6 years old, still in excellent condition, and acquired by a used equipment dealer in Durham who had kept it well and sold it back to Daniel without asking any questions about why someone was buying a piece of gear they had previously sold in what was clearly a cash flow crisis. And the dealer shook Daniel's hand and said he was glad it was going back to someone who knew how to use it. The suppliers who had been waiting on balances received payment in full, with a note acknowledging the delay. And 2 of them wrote back. One said he'd assumed Daniel would make it. The other said she'd known it all along. He kept both messages. The state agency's formal reinstatement paperwork arrived on a Friday afternoon. And he signed it over the weekend and returned it Monday morning. A brief call with the agency's project coordinator confirmed the timeline for resuming the corridor audit. They would pick up at the point where the freeze had interrupted the work. And the coordinator said something about the whole situation being unfortunate and unnecessary, which was the most accurate summary of the past 5 months Daniel had heard from anyone in an official capacity. He let none of it show publicly. He drove the same truck and ate at the same diner, wore the same field jacket, which now had a ticket-shaped rectangle, worn into the fabric of the inner breast pocket where he had carried the scratch card for an afternoon. And he did not change his routine in any visible way. Lydia and Warren and Keaton believed, as best he could determine, that Daniel was living in a borrowed apartment above a machine shop, which was close enough to the truth, and managing a company that had barely survived a near collapse. He did not correct either impression. The foundation took longer to structure correctly, and he wanted it done correctly before it was announced. And he had told no one about the idea, except Dana and Tom, and in both cases he had described it in practical terms rather than personal ones. The mission was narrow: free environmental testing services for communities that couldn't commission them, and delivered to the places that sat closest to industrial activity and furthest from the regulatory attention that activity usually generated. Schools, low-income residential neighborhoods near active industrial corridors, senior care facilities in areas with known exposure history, and there was a personal dimension, he explained to Tom one evening at the office when they were both still there after 7 looking at site maps together. Tom already knew most of it. He had been there since the 2nd year and had heard the story of Calvin Mercer's illness in pieces over a decade's worth of site work. Daniel told him the rest, the part about the specific neighborhood where Calvin had worked, and the part about the air quality data from that period that had never been systematically collected, that had never existed in any public record because nobody with the resources to collect it had ever been motivated to do so. Tom listened without interrupting, and then he said the only thing he needed to say, that he would manage the foundation's field operations alongside the company's, that there was nothing about that work he wasn't prepared to do, and that it sounded like exactly the right use of exactly the right amount of money. Daniels told Tom he would be receiving equity in Mercer Environmental, a formal stake, real, documented, filed, and Tom had worked through months of deferred compensation, a period when the health insurance lapsed, a near bankruptcy that would have wiped out everything they had built together. He had not asked for more than he was owed, and that was exactly why the equity was right. Tom sat with that information for a moment. Then he said he appreciated it. Then he picked up the site map they had been looking at and pointed to a property they hadn't assessed yet on the eastern edge of the corridor. Daniel had liked that response more than any other response he could have imagined. The weeks had a quality he hadn't expected, not peaceful exactly, and but functional in a way that the previous 5 months had not been. The arithmetic still required attention every day, but now the math was about allocation rather than survival. He was not accustomed to planning around abundance. And he made mistakes early, a trust disbursement that Dana caught and redirected before it created a tax complication, a timeline on the foundation's nonprofit filing that he had compressed too aggressively and had to rebuild at a more sustainable pace. And he learned from the mistakes the way he had always learned from site errors, by understanding the mechanism rather than just the outcome. He thought about Dana's warning every few days. The people who come back, the ones who removed themselves and would return. And he was not impatient about it. He understood that patience in this context was not passivity. He was waiting to see something specific, and he was going to see it clearly when it appeared. He thought about the journal more than he expected to, and the leather-covered notebook on the shelf in the Westover Hills bedroom. Dana had looked into recovery options and found the legal landscape more complex than a simple retrieval request, given the ongoing separation. And there was no urgent legal basis for immediate return of personal property when both parties were represented since separation was recent. She said they could pursue it through the formal process in due time. He told her he understood, and he was not going to ring a doorbell he no longer had a key to. Not for that, not yet. 3 weeks after the night in Westover Hills, Dana recommended going public, and a local news outlet had been working the Crosswinds Country Mart angle. The lottery story had generated regional coverage, and the station's reporters had begun narrowing the pool of likely ticket purchasers, using loyalty card data from the store and records of transactions during the relevant window. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the Mercer name to the NC64 site work that day. She said, better to step forward on his terms than to be found. And Daniel agreed to an appearance at RAL FM, a station with enough regional reach to establish the facts of his own account before any other version had a chance to solidify. He dressed the way he always dressed. He drove himself. And he sat in the station's lobby beforehand and thought about the restoration work he had scheduled for the following week on a soil monitoring array south of Harnett County, a site that had nothing to do with any of the and everything to do with why he had started the company in the first place. He walked onto the set. The host introduced him to the live audience. Whatever happened next, Daniel thought, the work that had been done before any of this, and the sites tested, the data collected, the neighborhoods informed, had happened independent of any of it. That was the part nobody could take back. He said what he had to say. And the radio interview ran on a Friday morning, and Daniel's phone began registering calls before the program had finished. Lydia called first, then Renata, then a number he didn't recognize that turned out, when he listened to the voicemail in the station parking lot, and to be Warren calling from his desk at the office rather than his cell. 3 separate messages in the span of 40 minutes, all careful, all composed in the specific way of language that has been drafted and revised before it is spoken. And Lydia said she hoped they could talk, that she understood this was complicated, that she didn't know this was coming. Renata's was longer and less coherent, something about the difficulty of recent weeks, and a suggestion that these kinds of situations were better handled within families, an implication that the public announcement had been premature without exactly saying so. Warren described the previous weeks as a difficult period under pressure for everyone and suggested they find time to sit down as a family and talk things through like reasonable people. His tone was the same measured executive register he had used the night he delivered his prepared remarks in the living room, authoritative and accustomed to being the one who determined when a conversation was over. None of them said they were wrong. They said the situation was regrettable. They said words had been spoken under stress. They said these things happen between people in difficult circumstances. But wrong, directly, personally wrong in what they had done, that word did not appear in any of the messages. Daniel listened to all 3 voicemails once. He did not call back. Keaton did not call. Keaton posted. And the clip appeared online by Friday afternoon. It was taken from the footage Keaton had recorded on his phone in the Caldwell living room, but not all of it. And what appeared publicly was a clip that began approximately 3.5 minutes into the confrontation, at a point after everything that had preceded it had been cut away. And in the footage, the viewer saw a man standing in a family's living room, expression flat, speaking in a low voice. There was no visible suitcase near the door, no separation papers on the coffee table, and no record of who had assembled the room or what had been said before the camera started. The clip showed Daniel reminding Keaton about the money that had covered Keaton's lease shortfall and business collapse. And without the preceding context, without Warren's prepared remarks or the suitcase or the separation agreement, the scene read differently than it had been. In Keaton's version, a man who had apparently just won $900 million was standing in his wife's family's home, listing past grievances while his wife and family sat in silence. Keaton's caption did the rest. It said Daniel had won the lottery and hidden it from his wife, and who had stood by him through years of professional failure, and had walked away the same night he found out he was rich. The phrasing was careful enough to function as implication rather than direct accusation, and which was how these things worked when someone understood how they worked. The clip spread faster than Daniel would have believed. By Saturday morning, the comment sections on every regional article about his win had split into two distinct camps, and a significant portion of the public had absorbed Keaton's version as the primary account. They were vocal, they were confident, and they cited specific details from the clip as evidence for conclusions the clip did not actually support. The other portion had questions, but the questioning camp was quieter and less certain, which was generally how these things went. Two of Mercer Environmental's prospective clients mentioned the controversy when their project managers reached out, and one asked diplomatically whether Daniel would like to address it before they moved forward with contract discussions. The other framed it as a general concern about organizational stability, which was a more careful way of saying the same thing, and the Mercer Clean Air Foundation's initial outreach had generated interest from two regional nonprofit networks and a community health organization in Durham. Both networks sent careful emails within 48 hours of the clip's appearance, asking for clarification before they committed to further engagement. And Daniel read all of it. He set his phone face down on the desk in the Barwell Road apartment and sat there for a while. He had known from the moment Keaton raised that phone in the Caldwell living room, and that there would be a version of events constructed from whatever Keaton had captured. He had known it with the clarity you develop when you watch someone angle a camera at you, with the specific expression of a person collecting material rather than recording a moment. And he had known and he had said nothing because the only effective response to that kind of recording in that kind of room was to give Keaton nothing worth using. And what he had not fully anticipated was the speed of it, or the degree to which a few thousand early comments could calcify a narrative before any correction had a chance to reach it. He waited. He was waiting for one specific thing, and he wanted to see whether Lydia, having heard the clip and the public response to it, would say anything publicly to correct it. She knew what had actually happened in that room, and she knew the sequence of events, that the separation agreement had been drafted and signed before any of it, that Daniel had not discovered the ticket until the following morning, that the confrontation had been arranged and waiting for him when he arrived. And she knew the truth in the same detailed way that people who were present know the truth. He gave it 48 hours. She said nothing. That silence was its own answer. He had understood that before he finished the first day of waiting, but he let himself wait the full 2 days because he wanted to be certain, and because part of him had still hoped he would be wrong. He was not wrong. Tom knocked on the doorframe of Daniel's office on Monday morning, and he came in and sat in the chair across from the desk, not his usual leaning in the doorway posture, but fully in the room, which told Daniel something. Tom set his own phone on the desk, face up, and "You know she's not going to say anything," Tom said. "I know. So what's the plan?" Daniel had been thinking about the answer to that question for 2 days. He knew what he was not going to do, and he was not going to build a counter-narrative that required him to dedicate sustained attention to the Caldwells and their reputations. He was not going to spend energy engineering a public humiliation for a family that had humiliated him in a room with 4 people present and a closed door. That kind of outcome would require him to care about their destruction, and he had already decided he was not going to let what they had done determine who he became. And what he was going to do was establish the factual record clearly, verifiably once, and let it stand. He said as much to Tom. Tom nodded in the way he nodded when he agreed with something, but had a qualification to add. And you're going to need something that holds up, Tom said. Keaton has video. You need to match that. Daniel had been thinking about that too, about the night in the Caldwell living room, and about the way Fiona had been sitting by the window, apart from the others, with her phone face up in her lap, and the way her right hand had moved when Keaton raised his camera. And he had not been certain what she had been doing. He had thought about it a number of times since that night and had not arrived at a conclusion. Then his phone buzzed on the desk between him and Tom, and screened Fiona Caldwell's name. A text message, brief, I need to show you something, can we meet? Tom read it upside down across the desk. He looked at Daniel for a moment. Well, he said, there it is. And they met at a coffee shop near the NC State campus, a quiet place, mid-morning, the kind of Tuesday morning lull when most of the tables were occupied by people with laptops and headphones who were not paying attention to anyone else. And Fiona arrived before him and chose a corner table with her back to the wall, which told him something about how she had been thinking about this meeting. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was living in the uncomfortable space, and after the decision, but before its consequences had fully arrived. She waited until Daniel had his coffee and had settled into the chair across from her before she started. Then she told him what she had done, and the night in the Caldwell living room, when Keaton had reached into his jacket and raised his phone and angled it toward Daniel with the precision of someone who had thought about the angle in advance. And something in Fiona had decided that she was not going to allow Keaton to be the only person in that room with a record of what happened. She had seen Keaton record things before. She knew how he used recordings, and she had calculated, in the span of a few seconds, what a recording made by Keaton alone would become, and what it would leave out. She had opened her own camera app without announcing it, and she had done it quietly, the way you do something when you are not sure yet whether it will matter, but are not willing to risk that it won't. She had held the phone in her lap with the screen facing forward, and at an angle that captured the room rather than just the corner. Keaton was focused on, and she had let it run until after Daniels had signed the papers and picked up the duffel and walked out the front door. And she had gone home that night and watched the footage. She had not known what to do with it. For the 3 weeks between that night and the radio interview, she had kept it on her phone and not told anyone it existed. And when the public clip from Keaton appeared after the interview, she had watched it twice. She had looked at the timestamp on her own recording, and then she had sent Daniel the text. And she plugged her phone into the table's charging port and turned the screen toward him. The recording was cued. He watched it. It began before Keaton's clip did, before anyone's camera was raised, before Warren had finished his opening remarks. And the frame captured the living room from Fiona's position near the window, the coca table, Lydia seated on the couch, Warren standing at the far wall, Renata on the side seat, Keaton near the entrance with his phone coming up. And the audio was clear. The space and arrangement were visible. Daniel listened to Warren's prepared remarks, measured and executive, delivered to a room that had been arranged to receive them. He heard Renata's addition, and he heard Keaton say what he had said about Mercer Environmental, and he heard his own response. The correction about Keaton's financial history, flat and factual, spoken without heat, and he could hear the quality of his own voice more clearly from outside it than he had been able to hear it in the moment. Not angry, not reactive, just placing a fact where it belonged. He heard Lydia present the papers, and He heard himself ask whether this was her decision or the family's. And then, visible in the recording, he saw it again from outside himself for the first time. Lydia's head turning, the half-second glance toward her father before she turned back and gave her answer. And on Fiona's recording, the movement was unmistakable. It was brief, involuntary, the kind of thing a person does without fully deciding to do it. But it was there, and the camera had captured it. And it was the most honest thing in the entire room that night. And then, visible in the background throughout the second half of the recording, on the Caldwell's television set that no one had thought to watch, and that had been running the evening news in the unattended room behind the living room, was the NC Lottery segment. The numbers appeared on screen while Daniel was still in the room, while he was still reading the separation papers, and while he was still holding the pen. Fiona tapped the screen to show him the file properties. The recording start timestamp was 12 minutes before the lottery segment aired. The footage also established something else that Dana had already confirmed legally, but that the public didn't know, and the separation papers were already on the table when Daniel arrived. He had not walked in and then decided to leave after winning. He had arrived to sign papers that had been drafted and awaiting his signature. And the win, documented on the television in the background, had occurred while he was still in the room completing a process that Lydia had set in motion days before. Keaton's version had implied a sequence that was, by the evidence in Fiona's recording, factually impossible. And Daniel watched it through to the end. He watched himself pick up the duffel. He watched the door close. Then he watched the empty living room for 30 seconds after he had left. And the camera still running, the television still showing the lottery broadcast, the numbers still on screen, Warren walking to the window to look out, and Keaton lowering his phone and sliding it back into his jacket pocket with the satisfied expression of a man who had gotten what he came for. He set the phone down on the table. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. Fiona was watching him. She was not performing composure. She was doing something harder, and sitting in a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, having made a decision that was going to put to her on one side of a line within her own family, and sitting with that fact without flinching, he thanked her. And he said what she had done required something that most people in rooms like that one struggle to find, the willingness to be the person who makes a record of the truth at a cost to themselves. And she nodded once and looked at her coffee. Then she looked back at him. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "Not just about the recording. I should have said something in that room before you left. And I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks." He told her something he had come to believe over the years of doing field work in places where problems had accumulated precisely because nobody had documented them early enough. That silence, and in the face of something that's happening wrong, has a way of extending the life of the wrong thing. That it isn't neutrality. It just looks like neutrality from the outside, while doing the work of the wrong thing from the inside. And she said she understood that now in a way she hadn't before. "Will you let me use this?" he asked. Not the full recording as a public document. He didn't want to build a counter-campaign. And didn't want to turn the Caldwell's living room into a performance for public consumption. He was thinking of something more specific, a verified statement, released through Dana's office, accompanied by the legal timeline, and a short excerpt from the footage that showed the television broadcast, and the timestamp. Fiona said yes without hesitating. He asked if she had thought about what this meant for her relationship with her family. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she said she had thought about very little else for 3 weeks, and that she had arrived at the same conclusion each time. She could live with her family being angry at her, and she had more difficulty, as it turned out, living with being the person who watched something wrong happen and stayed in the corner with her hands in her lap. Daniel sat with that for a moment, and then he took out his phone and called Dana Hartley. He told her about the recording. He told her the timestamp, the content, the second half of the clip with the lottery broadcast visible on the television in the background. And he told her Fiona had agreed to provide it. Dana was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "I think it's time to have a meeting, my office. And tell the Caldwells, all of them, that I'd like everyone present." He said he understood. He ended the call and set the phone on the table. Outside the coffee shop window, the NC State campus moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning. Students and a delivery truck, leaves coming down from the oaks in the October wind. Fiona was looking at him with the expression of someone who has said what they came to say and is now prepared for whatever follows. "When?" she asked. "And Dana will set the date," he said, "soon." He stood, put on his jacket, and picked up his coffee to go. He turned back at the door. "Thank you," he said again. And not because he hadn't already said it, but because it was the right thing to say twice in this case. She nodded. He left. Dana's conference room was on the third floor, a rectangular space with a table that seated 8 and windows facing Fayetteville Street. No family photographs, no inherited furniture, the kind of neutral ground that belongs to no one in particular, which was exactly the point. When Daniel arrived, they were already there. And Warren sat at one end of the table, jacket on, hands folded, the posture of a man who had decided to be composed before the meeting began, and was now maintaining that decision as a form of strategy. And Renata sat to his left in a chair she had positioned slightly back from the table, which gave her the option to observe without appearing to participate. Lydia sat across from the space Daniel would take, and Keaton had claimed the chair at the far end of the table, pulled slightly back from the edge, which was his version of the same option Renata had exercised. Fiona sat near the window, separate from the others, hands in her lap, watching. And on the table in front of Lydia, Daniel saw it before he had fully registered the rest of the room, was a worn leather notebook, brown cover, aged brass clasp, and a faint water stain on the lower right corner from a field season in industrial rain gear. Calvin Mercer's field journal. Lydia had her hands resting near it but not on it. And the way a person positions themselves near something they have been carrying for a while and are not quite ready to release. He sat down across from her. He waited. Lydia explained before anything else was said. And she had taken the journal from the bedroom shelf before the meeting that Tuesday night. She had held on to it. She said this, knowing how it would sound, and she said it anyway. And because she had apparently decided that honesty was the only thing she had left that might mean something. Because she had believed that if Daniel needed it enough to come back for it, he would have to speak to her. And she could hear, even as she described it, the calculation in that reasoning. He listened to her explain it without interrupting. When she finished, what he felt was not what he had expected. It was something quieter than anger, and the specific grief of learning that someone had understood exactly what mattered to you and had chosen to use that understanding as leverage. She said she was sorry. She said her father had spent months making the case that Mercer Environmental's failure was inevitable, and that staying meant sharing a collapse, that Lydia's options were closing, and she needed to act before they closed further. She said she knew that wasn't an excuse. Then she said she still loved him, and asked if there was any version of a conversation, and any version at all, where a different future was possible. She looked at him directly when she said it. He gave her the honesty the question deserved. He told her he thought her apology was at least partly sincere, and he meant that, and he was not trying to wound her with the qualification. But he also told her that sincerity and trustworthiness were not the same thing, and that the night in that living room had shown him something he could not unsee. And she had looked toward her father before answering a question about whose decision this was. 1 second, one involuntary movement, and in it was the complete structure of where her loyalty actually lived when it was tested. An apology did not overwrite that, and it acknowledged it. The difference mattered. Warren leaned forward at that point. He said families went through difficult periods and that reasonable people could find their way through them. His tone was the same measured executive register he had deployed in his own living room, calm and authoritative, accustomed to being the person who determined when a conversation ended. Renata added that Lydia had been a devoted partner for many years, and that devotion deserved recognition even in difficult circumstances. Neither of them said they were wrong, and they said the situation was complicated. They said things had been said under stress. Wrong directly, that word did not appear from either of them. Keaton spoke last, and he described what had happened with the posted clip as things getting away from him, the algorithm taking content further than he had intended, the nature of social media being unpredictable. And he said it would be reasonable, given everything, for everyone to move forward without the involvement of attorneys. His voice was steady. Daniel had watched Keaton raise that phone in his parents' living room with the precision of someone who had thought about the camera angle in advance. He knew the difference between a person who had made a mistake and a person who was now negotiating the consequences of a deliberate decision. Keaton was doing the second thing. And then Fiona stood up. She had been so still through the first portion of the meeting that the room had almost absorbed her into the background. She stood with her hands at her sides and addressed everyone at the table, and her own family included, with the precision of someone who had been deciding exactly what to say for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment of saying it. And she told the room what she had told Daniel at the coffee shop. She described exactly what she had done the night in the living room. Seeing Keaton raise his phone and making a decision in a span of seconds, opening her own camera quietly and letting it run. She connected her phone to the room's display screen without asking permission. The recording played. Warren's prepared remarks, audible and clear, Renata's additions, and Keaton's commentary about Mercer Environmental and his phone coming up. Daniel's correction about Keaton's financial history delivered without heat. Lydia presenting the papers. Daniel's question, whose decision was this? The half-second turn of Lydia's eyes toward Warren before she spoke, and in the background, on the television set running in the adjacent room, the NC lottery segment. The numbers appearing on screen, the broadcast timestamp, the footage still running while Daniel read the papers and signed them and picked up his duffel. And Fiona showed the file properties. The timestamp placed the start of the recording 12 minutes before the lottery segment aired. The room was silent when the footage ended. Keaton sat back, not quite another inch of distance from the table, but close. And he looked at the screen and then at his hands and said nothing. Warren looked at the window. He did not speak. Renata looked at Lydia, and Lydia looked at the table. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ambient noise from the street 3 floors below. Daniel spoke. He told the room what he was going to do and what he was not going to do. And he was going to release a verified factual statement through Dana's office, the legal filing dates, the separation timeline, a short excerpt from Fiona's recording showing the television broadcast visible in the background, and the timestamp that placed it before Daniel discovered the ticket's value. The public record would be accurate. He was not going to pursue legal action against Keaton if Keaton removed the clip and did not post further misleading content. And he was not going to dedicate time or energy to publicly dismantling the Caldwell's reputations. He said that last part not as a concession to them, but as a line he was drawing for himself. And he had decided he was not going to let what had happened determine who he became. That meant not becoming the kind of person who channeled a year's worth of accumulated grievance into a public campaign against a family that had treated him poorly. And it would require dedicating attention to their humiliation, and he had other things to do with that attention. He looked at Lydia when he finished. She was looking at the table, and he told her again what he had told her before. He believed her apology was partly sincere. But sincerity and trustworthiness were different things, and the glance toward Warren in that living room had told him everything he needed to know about the distance between them. And he was not able to bridge that distance with forgiveness. He wished her well. He meant that. He picked up his father's journal from the table in front of her. He put it inside his jacket. And then he stood up and thanked Dana for arranging the meeting. He thanked Fiona, clearly and directly, in a room full of people who had not made the same choice she had made. And he told her that what she did took something most people struggle to find. She nodded once. That was enough. He left the conference room, took the elevator to the ground floor, and walked out onto Fayetteville Street into an ordinary October afternoon. And the city moved around him in its usual patterns. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hand inside his jacket, where the leather notebook sat in the inner pocket. He thought about his father, and he thought about the basement apartment on Barwell Road, and the narrow bed, and the sound of the leaves in the backyard wind. He thought about what Dana had said about people who come back, and how you learn to see the difference between what they're returning to and what they're returning for. He knew the difference now. He had seen it clearly in a conference room on the third floor of a building on Fayetteville Street. And in the specific way, a person looks at a table when they have run out of things to say that aren't the truth. He started walking. Dana released the statement the following morning, and it was 3 paragraphs. The legal filing dates, the separation timeline, a single sentence about the recording that confirmed the lottery broadcast had been airing in the background of the living room while Daniel was still signing the papers. And attached was a 40-second excerpt from Fiona's footage, the portion that showed the television screen clearly. No narration, no editorial framing, just the documentation, presented cleanly, with the accuracy that documentation provides when it has not been selected to support a conclusion. And by afternoon, the comment sections had shifted. Keaton removed the clip. He did not post an explanation. By the following day, several outlets that had run the misleading version published corrections, and some of them acknowledged specifically that the original framing had been based on partial information. One reporter wrote that the story had moved faster than the facts, which was the most accurate way Daniel had seen anyone describe what had happened. And the 2 nonprofit networks that had sent cautious emails responded within 48 hours of the statement's release. Both moved forward with the foundation engagement, and 3 days after the statement, Lydia posted something on her social media. And it was short, 5 sentences, publicly visible. She said that the clip shared by her brother had been incomplete and had not reflected the actual sequence of events. She said the separation agreement had been filed before Daniel's lottery win. And she said she was correcting the record because it was the accurate one. Daniel saw it on his phone in the Mercer Environmental break room. He read it twice. He didn't call her. And he thought about what he had said at the conference room table. I'll believe that if I see what you do next. And he let the thought settle without adding anything to it. He had arranged to meet her one more time. And he had sent the message 2 days after the conference room, before the statement was released. A coffee shop on the north side of town. Somewhere that wasn't her parents' neighborhood, wasn't anywhere they had gone together as a couple, and she was already there when he arrived. She looked like someone who had been through something that had rearranged her from the inside and was still finding out what the arrangement was going to be. She said she wasn't there to try again, and she had a few things she wanted to say that weren't in any room with other people present. He sat across from her and listened. She said she had known, while it was happening, that what they were doing was wrong, not complicated, and not the product of difficult circumstances. Wrong in the flat, simple meaning of the word. She had known it while her father was speaking in the living room, while she was sliding the folder across the coffee table, and while she was watching Daniel read through the papers she had signed. She had known it, and she had let it happen because the alternative was standing in front of her father and telling him she disagreed with him, and that was the specific thing she had spent her entire adult life finding reasons not to do. She wasn't asking him to forgive the decision. She was telling him she understood what it had cost, and that the understanding wasn't something she was going to be able to set down. He told her he believed her. He said it carefully, meaning it, not as a concession, not as the beginning of something, but as the truth. And he did believe her. He also told her that there was a difference between forgiving someone and rebuilding something with them, and that the distance between those two things in this case was not something he was willing to close. And he wished her something better than this. He genuinely did. Not in the hollow way people mean the phrase when they mean the opposite, but as the actual hope that she would find whatever she was looking for. And when she was finally willing to look for it without her father's opinion determining the direction, she nodded. She looked out the window at the parking lot. He stood to leave. "You didn't lose me when I got rich," he said. "And you lost me when you showed me who you were." He meant it as a fact rather than a wound. He believed she knew the difference. He left. The Mercer Clean Air Foundation's first full installation was 6 weeks later. And an air quality monitoring system, sensors, data relays, the kind of continuous baseline measurement that documented what people were breathing without requiring anyone to commission a specific study, and installed at an elementary school 2 miles from a stretch of industrial corridor on the eastern edge of the city. It was the kind of neighborhood where nobody had commissioned a study before, because the people and who lived there had never had the resources to, and the organizations that might have done it had always found other priorities. The air quality in that corridor had been unmeasured for decades, and what the data was going to show, they would find out when they found it out. That was the point. Tom was there. He had managed the installation timeline, coordinated the permits, and driven the equipment van himself on the morning of the setup. And Fiona had come. She had asked to attend, and Daniel had said, of course, and she had stood near the equipment van with her hands in her jack pockets, and watched the crew work with the expression of someone doing something they had chosen rather than something they had landed in. The crew ran the final checks and surmounts at mid-morning. The network connected cleanly. The data feed was live, and a woman from the neighborhood came over to where Daniel was standing at the edge of the parking lot. She was in her 50s, wearing a jacket with the school's logo, and she looked at the equipment on the utility poles for a moment before she looked at him. She asked if he was the one who had set this up. He said yes. She said, "Thank you," in the way people say it, and when they mean something more than the words can hold. He said, "You're welcome," in the same way. That was the whole conversation. She went back to the group of community members near the entrance. He watched the crew finish their final walkthrough, and Tom came over and stood beside him. Daniel put his hand into the inside pocket of his field jacket. The leather notebook was there, Calvin Mercer's field journal, worn cover, brass clasp, the field notes of a man and who had spent 22 years in the kinds of industrial facilities that left their signatures in the lungs of the people who worked in them. He hadn't opened it since the day he had retrieved it from the conference room table, and he held it now without taking it out. He had once read a line near the end of the notebook, one his father had written near the end of a long shift, the handwriting more compressed than earlier entries, and as if he was trying to fit more onto the page than the page wanted to hold. His father had written that a man cannot choose the work he inherits, but he can choose what he does with it, and he had meant it practically, the decisions about equipment and process and maintenance that accumulated over a long career of industrial work. But Calvin Mercer had also been a person who understood that practical wisdom and personal wisdom were often the same sentence, written about different subjects. Daniel had been trying to do something with what he had inherited ever since: the company, the foundation, and the particular understanding of what it means to work in places that don't get measured and to carry data back to the people who need it. The money hadn't changed what he was doing. It had just given it room to operate. And Tom said something about the next site on the foundation's schedule, a residential neighborhood near a former textile corridor in the western part of the county. And Daniel turned to listen, and the conversation moved into the practical, which was and where both of them preferred to be. The sensor array ran its quiet measurements overhead. The community members made their way back toward the school building. The October light came through the oaks in the angle of a late morning that was in no particular hurry to become anything other than what it was. And if you've heard this story and something in it landed for you, the people who showed up in it are worth thinking about, not the ones who made the headlines. And the ones who handed over a key without being asked, who stayed at their desks when staying was costly, who turned a camera toward the truth in a room full of people who would have preferred it stayed dark. Hold on to those people. And the rest of this, the money, the correction, all of it, it matters a lot less than you'd think. What matters is who was there before any of it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one.